Welcome back to The Explainer by Sense Talking. All right, today we're tackling a really big question, one that comes straight from our source material. Is the African Union, well, is it a real union or is it all just for show? We're going to be digging into some powerful critiques, looking at this huge gap between the incredible vision for the AU and, well, the reality on the ground. And this quote really sets the tone for our whole discussion today. The African Union is not a union, it's a performance. Wow, I mean, that's a heck of an accusation, right? It basically questions the entire point of the organization. So let's unpack that. Let's see what's behind this claim.
Okay, so before we can get into the criticism, we've got to understand the dream. Where did this all start? Well, it began with this incredibly powerful idea, the vision of a unified Africa, speaking with one voice, totally free from those old colonial lines on the map.
And, for the Pan-Africanist leaders who championed this, people like Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba, this wasn't some pipe dream. It wasn't just a nice idea. They saw a United States of Africa as a matter of survival, a strategic move to build a continent that was truly strong and independent on the world stage.
But here's the thing, was Africa ever really a single unified entity to begin with? The sources we're looking at argue that if you dig into the history of independence, you find a story that's way more complicated. It's a story full of cracks and fractures that were there right from the start.
So we often hear that Ghana's independence in 1957 was the big domino that started it all. But look at this timeline. The reality is much messier. Liberia was a republic more than 100 years earlier, and Egypt and Sudan both gained their sovereignty before Ghana did. So what gives? Why isn't their independence the story we always tell? Well, the answer seems to be in these early disconnects. Right from the get-go, some of the key players had different allegiances that just pulled them in other directions. Liberia's founding story was completely different. It wasn't a classic anti-colonial fight. And then you have Egypt and Sudan who felt a stronger connection to the Arab world. This created some deep divides in any idea of continental solidarity before it even had a chance to really form. And that brings us to today, and the modern AU itself. Now, it was designed to be a bit like the European Union, a real political and economic heavyweight. But the sources we're looking at make a pretty strong case that, in practice, it operates in a completely different universe. All right, check this out. This comparison really hits home. The dream? Complete freedom of movement. The reality? So many visa restrictions that it can actually be easier for an African to fly to Paris than to a neighboring country. The dream? A single currency, the afro. The reality? People are trading in foreign currencies like the French franc or the US dollar. And a unifying African language? Nope. The languages of the former colonizers, English, French, Arabic, are still the ones that dominate. And this all leads to this really sharp quote from our source material. The AU is addicted to conferences and allergic to courage. Ouch. The argument here is that you get an organization that's fantastic at holding meetings, with great speeches and fancy dinners. But when it comes to making a tough, courageous decision, it just doesn't happen. So this really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If the problems are so obvious, why can't the AU step in and do something about the continent's biggest crises? Things like corruption, conflict. What's holding it back? And the answer, at least according to the sources we've reviewed, comes down to this core principle, non-interference. It sounds reasonable, right? But what it means in practice is that member states basically promise not to meddle in each other's business. This effectively gives national leaders a free pass, shielding them from any real accountability from their peers on the continent. And look, this isn't just some abstract political debate. This inability to act, this paralysis, it has devastating real-life consequences for millions of people all across the continent. Take the Congo, for instance, a country with unbelievable mineral wealth that has just fueled decades of horrific conflict. Our source material puts it bluntly. It's a case of foreign greed meets internal betrayal. Global powers exploit the resources, local leaders fail their people, and the AU is mostly just a spectator. And then you have Somalia. Its collapse and ongoing struggles just lay bare how weak the continent's tools are for helping a nation rebuild. The source calls it a tragic ghost of what it could have been. And that's a really haunting image, isn't it? It's a reminder of the AU's failure to heal its own members. Okay, so we've looked at the broken promises from the start and the powerlessness of the present, which brings us to the big question, the final verdict. When you put all this evidence together, is the African Union a real thing, or is it just an illusion? Forget the fancy buildings and the official letterheads for a second. The question our sources are really pushing us to ask is a much deeper one. Does the AU actually exist in a meaningful way? Is it a true union that people feel a part of?
And here's the bottom line. The AU, as it stands today, just doesn't have the teeth to enforce the very things it was created to protect: dignity and unity. It's a body that can talk about tyranny but can't prosecute it. It can talk about harmony but can't enforce it.
And so the conclusion is pretty stark. The AU is an expensive illusion. This assessment basically says it's a performance of unity, put on for the world and for the leaders themselves, rather than a real working system that actually delivers solutions for everyday people. It's a lot of show with very little substance.
But it's not all negative. The critique doesn't just point out the problems. It actually offers a kind of roadmap. Our sources lay out what a real union would look like, and these aren't just vague dreams. They're concrete, practical steps that could totally transform the continent.
And until those things happen, the final, really provocative thought we're left with is this. The African Union might just stay as an idea on a map, lines drawn by colonizers, instead of becoming a real, living thing that beats in the hearts of its people.